You're listening to episode 80 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Rebecca Crane returns to the podcast to speak with us about the new paper, What Defines Mindfulness-Based Programs? The Warp and the Weft. With the proliferation of programs using the word mindfulness in their title, there comes a valid question. How does the consumer know this really is a mindfulness program? And how do I know my teacher has been adequately trained? Just 2 days ago, as of this recording, I saw an advertisement for an MBSR course that was clearly not an MBSR course. It was half the contact time, and perhaps inadvertently misleading attendees about what they were getting. So what are the common factors across the board, regardless of the specific program details? Rebecca Crane directs the Center for Mindfulness Research and Practice and has played a leading role in the development of both the training and research sides of the center since it was founded in 2001. Prior to this, she worked for 15 years in the mental health field as an occupational therapist and an integrative counselor. Rebecca has had personal interest in meditation for over 25 years, and personal practice is an integral part of her life. She has received training in the use of mindfulness-based approaches through working with Mark Williams and colleagues from the early development of MBCT teaching, through to current work on the Oxford Bangor University investigation of MBCT for people with recurrent depression and suicidality, through a 15-year and ongoing engagement with the teachers in MBSR training programs at the Center for Mindfulness in Massachusetts. Rebecca is a certified MBSR teacher with the Center for Mindfulness in Massachusetts and has written Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy, Distinctive Features. Our guest today returning is Rebecca Crane. Becca, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted.
So very glad to have you with us again. You last spoke with us about the mindfulness-based intervention teaching assessment criteria in episode 32. So for those who are interested in finding out a bit more about Rebecca's background, please do check that out. I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode. Today, we're here to talk about a paper that was recently released, for which you were one of the co-authors, What Defines Mindfulness-Based Programs, the Warp and the Weft. I'm wondering if you would mention the co-authors and who they are.
Right, yeah. So this was a paper very deliberately written by leaders in the field on either side of the Atlantic. So John Kabat-Zinn, Mark Williams, Saki Santarelli, Christina Feldman, Judd Brewer, Willem Kijken. So representatives from the Centre for Mindfulness at UMass, from the Oxford Mindfulness Centre in the UK, and from myself at Bangor University in the UK.
And what are the factors that led to the writing of this paper? There's some really good stories there about this ongoing engagement that you have had.
I think I could probably trace it back to when I came over to Boston to the Center for Mindfulness conference to offer a keynote on our work on teacher competence. And that started conversations about developments on either side of the Atlantic. And Saki was keen to keep that engagement going. And we were very keen also to keep the conversation alive. So a year later, Saki came over and we had an informal private meeting in Oxfordshire in a very beautiful abbey with colleagues from the Exeter University Mindfulness Centre, Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and the Bangor Centre for Mindfulness Research and Practice. And Saki and our group spent time over a few days in dialogue, spending some time in practice and some time in conversation. We spent a lot of time actually looking at recordings of our students and trainees doing teaching practice and sharing with Saki how we were engaged in reflecting on the issues around competence. And this led into wider conversation about shared concerns about integrity in the field more broadly. There were a number of threads to that, but a particular thread was the concern that there's a lot of things happening out there in the name of mindfulness-based stress reduction, in the name of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, that we don't recognize as those program forms. And it seemed a really, like if we as the, in that room at that moment were key representatives of those program forms. And if we were not in a good position to be communicating to the field a joined up view of what integrity looks like when you're calling something MBSR or MBCT, then who could? So our sense was that actually there would be a huge amount of strength in offering a paper that aimed to be definitional position statement paper that was a joined up view from both sides of the Atlantic. One other risk that we had a sense of within the field was the risk that the MBCT developments could split off from the MBSR developments, that they could sort of happen in parallel but not in an integrated way. And we were keen to bring together the field, this sense of an emerging field of mindfulness-based programs, mindfulness-based interventions, and to communicate the coherence that there is across the whole field. Of course, there's differences in program forms, but there's also commonalities. So the paper was aimed to really articulate what's common across any program that gives itself the label mindfulness-based. That was what we set out to do. The paper itself took a long time to write. It was quite an extraordinary process of going to and fro and having conversations within our authorship group, and then putting it out to review and having a lot of pushback in the review process. So there was a lot of versions and editing until we moved towards this final version.
I'm wondering if we might digress for a moment and unpack a little bit of the pushback you may have received in those initial versions. What kinds of things came up and how did they help make it perhaps a stronger paper because of it?
Well, I actually do feel they made it a stronger paper. It was an example for me of peer review processes actually really strengthening the finished product. So there were a number of themes to the reviews, but one theme was a critique that although we were saying in the paper that mindfulness is not a panacea, there was a risk that we were actually presenting it in that way because we were talking about the underpinning frameworks of mindfulness, offering a universal understanding of how human suffering happens. And the reviewer was saying back to us, what are the limits of universal? And on a scientific basis, does that have credibility? So I think that a lot of the reviews that came back were really steering us to contextualize the work much more within mainstream contemporary psychological language and framework. So we were critiqued for using words like suffering, which in contemporary psychology doesn't have clear definition.
And that makes a great deal of sense when you see things as mindfulness programming is very strongly informed by traditional contexts, which many of us are in. We tend to use reflexively terms that we've grown up with and known for years without thinking, but it's a different context. And as we think about this in a secular setting or a scientific setting, what does that maybe mean a little more distinctly?
Yeah, so I think we were being steered very helpfully to being clearer about our languaging and moving us more towards using mainstream language, not using Pali terms. We're actually really finding ordinary mainstream language to express ourselves. Although interestingly, one reviewer felt that we weren't going far enough in articulating what the Buddhist underpinnings were. So there was almost like two polarized themes within the reviews. One was that it needs to move more towards the mainstream, and one was that we need to be clearer about the Buddhist underpinnings. And I think that's a theme that we often get caught between in the mindfulness-based world. We're not Buddhist enough, or we're too Buddhist, depending on where the reviewer is coming from.
Exactly. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't, because there's an understandable sense of propriety, I think, on the more traditional sides of, but this is ours and it is this that, I've often found, although I understand that passion and care, having experienced it myself, maybe there's room enough for it to be something else as well.
Absolutely. That's my sense. And in a way, the way that we responded to those reviewers was to really acknowledge that, that we were skirting over a lot of richness that is there within the traditions, but that actually in the context of mindfulness-based programs, what the particular frameworks that we're drawing on are those that within the Buddhist traditions are universal. They cross over all of the range of Buddhist traditions that there have been. So it is in a way the common frameworks that you would find in these traditions that have found their way into mindfulness-based programs, and then they're recontextualized in ways that enable us to use them in mainstream contexts.
Yes, that's often been a question that I put forth to those from a traditional setting with an understandable concern is, let's first land on which is that one true Buddhism.
Yes.
And once we do that, then we'll be happy to articulate appropriately. But that is, of course, the challenge. It's not just what's appropriate from one context. It's making it more available as a human experience. So speaking of terms, then, in the title you do use the terms warp and weft. And I'm wondering if you'd care to describe what that is, and then how it applies to MBPs.
So this was a metaphor which emerged through our conversations, because essentially what we were aiming to articulate is what is always going to be there, regardless of the population, regardless of the context. When something is called mindfulness-based, what are the absolutes? And then what are the variables? And we use this metaphor of warp and weft. So when you're weaving cloth and you set up the loom, the threads that you set up in the first instance are the absolutes, as it were. So they're the ones that you establish before you really start your weaving, and they're there on the loom throughout the creation of your piece of fabric. And then through that, you interweave different colors and textures that then create the particular unique texture of that particular piece of cloth. And this seemed to be a metaphor for us that actually really helped. It helped us to kind of visualize it in our minds. In one version of the paper, we actually had a visual of a warp and weft weaving piece, but the reviewers didn't like that, so that dropped out. And at one point, there was some discussion of whether it should be warp and woof, because apparently in America, it's more normally called woof than weft. But we ended up with warp and weft as a metaphor for this absolute and variable elements.
Right. And it's a beautiful metaphor as well, because it allows that uniqueness of the context, the richness of that color and that pattern and whatever is there along with, and yet it is still cloth. It is still stable and strong and can wrap you in the experience of mindfulness.
Right. And I had a connection with one of our trainees a couple of weeks ago who is also a weaver. And she was saying to me that one of the things that she's very aware of in her weaving work is that unless the warp threads have strength, the whole cloth falls apart. So there's something really critical about those absolute elements, that the integrity of the program really relies on those. And then from that basis, there's room for creativity to help you really be sensitive and nuanced about how this particular mindfulness-based program offering is going to really meet this particular moment, these particular people in this particular setting.
So what are some of the difficulties in articulating those commonalities or those differences across mindfulness-based programs?
There was a lot of conversation about this. It took quite a bit to and fro within the author group. I guess, there was some need for each, because we were representing in a way, the MBCT developments within the field and the MBSR developments within the field. And, there's differences between those two programs. So we were needing to let go of what's particular within those programs and come to commonality, what's common between MBCT and MBSR. And that was interesting because what emerged in that was not just difference in content, but sometimes a difference in spirit, which was quite subtle in a way, but was definitely there in the flavor of things. But actually, as we did this to and fro, it emerged, the framework that we have now, within the paper feels pretty robust. It did feel, quite ultimately very doable to clarify what are the absolutes, what really does need to be present in a mindfulness program to call it mindfulness-based. In the end, there was nuance, but there wasn't that much controversy.
And I wonder if there's a term we've been using a bit, and there's perhaps a distinction that would be worth spending a few moments on, is a mindfulness-based,
yes,
and a mindfulness-informed, I think is the term we were using. Yeah. Say more about that, because that is a subtle but profound nuance.
It is, because it felt like what we were particularly doing in a way was distinguishing. So there's a lot of things that are happening in mainstream context that are happening in the name of mindfulness. And part of what we were doing was distinguishing programs that were mindfulness based from a number of other interventions which have, huge credibility, and many of them have evidence underpinning them, but they are something different. So the kind of core distinction that we named within the paper was that mindfulness-based interventions, programs, the central methodology for supporting participants to change, to build awareness, to transition is the practice of mindfulness. So mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, the core modality that's used within those programs is the practice of mindfulness. Whereas mindfulness-informed programs, so dialectical behavior therapy would be an example, and there's many others, acceptance and commitment therapy, they use practices within them. Short mindfulness practices are used in those, certainly in dialectical behavior therapy, not so much in acceptance and commitment therapy. They're surrounded by the philosophy of mindfulness. The ethos of mindfulness is definitely in there. But they have different modalities for supporting change within those programs. They're not actually basing their core therapeutic process on the practice of mindfulness. They have different ways of doing that. So the orientation is different. This is important because on this hangs a lot of other things. Because the practice of mindfulness is critical within mindfulness-based programs, that means that the embodiment of the teacher is critical, and that means that the training process is particular. So it's a distinction which is really important, because from that cascades a whole lot of implications about how we hold them.
Yeah, and it's important to note that this distinction, this clarity between mindfulness-based and mindfulness-informed, it doesn't mean that one is more or less effective. It's not a judgment between the two. It's simply an appropriate understanding of what the boundaries are with them.
Absolutely, yes. So the important thing is that if you're using a model, to stay with that model, to work within the frameworks of that model. So if you're calling it mindfulness-based stress reduction, to really have fidelity to that form. If you're calling it dialectical behavior therapy, that has its own integrity, and have fidelity to that form and really adhere to the training processes and principles that have been developed in that particular training modality, because each has their own integrity. Each has their own evidence base. So yeah, it's not a judgment about the value of different interventions, but about what's needed in order to be able to hold them and deliver them.
One of the things that I liked very much about the way this was articulated, and for those who are listening, I will be linking to the paper on the episode page so you can check this out for yourself, is that you do, in addition to having warp and weft as categories, you also talk about the warp and the weft for the program itself as well as for the teacher. And
Yes.
I want you to spend a moment just waxing rhapsodic on the criticality of the teacher in MBPs.
Yeah, so we, as you say, we had these two areas that we explored, what's essential. So it's particularly important that if you're teaching a mindfulness-based program, that you're really embedded in that context through training. So a mindfulness-based teacher has developed through their training process particular competencies which enable them to effectively offer that program. And that includes a range of different things. And this is where the work on the mindfulness-based interventions teaching assessment criteria that work has really aimed to unpack what those competencies are. Critically, one of those areas is embodiment. And this is what emerges through the practice of mindfulness. So a teacher of mindfulness-based programs is able to teach the principles of mindfulness, both through what they teach, but also through how they teach it. Because through the practice, they've got an embedded inside-out understanding of working with their own experience and meeting the experience of others through the spirit of mindfulness, through the core essence of mindfulness as a practice. And that takes time. That doesn't happen in an instant. That's a sustained engagement of that person with this particular way of exploring experience.
There's one other brief digression that I want to make, and this is one of the many factors involved with those who perhaps come from a more traditional background, who are putting us in the penalty box either as being too Buddhist or not Buddhist enough, is that and I've said this many times in discussions and honoring that point of view, having had it myself and really understanding that I totally understand the merit of that, the history and the richness of that, is that it's not the only thing which informs these programs. And you list some of the influences of contemplative mindfulness practices. Of course, there's that, but also science and medicine and psychology, and in particular, one that I really liked that you listed was education. That teaching methodologies are also a huge factor in how these programs are articulated. I wonder if you could just speak for a few moments about these aspects to MBPs that might distinguish it from traditional settings.
Yeah, so these different epistemologies, different ways of thinking, different ways of understanding the world, these threads inform mindfulness-based programs. And partly they're theoretical frameworks that go underneath them that help us to understand what's happening and why it's happening within a mindfulness-based program. They partly go to inform the intentionality of particular curriculum elements. But they also, and the one that you named particularly was education, they also inform the pedagogy of how mindfulness-based programs are taught. So there's a huge emphasis within mindfulness-based programs on participatory, experiential engagement with the practice. So there is a very distinct absence of dogma, of telling people what they should understand. The process always starts with people having the opportunity to link with their direct experience through the practice of mindfulness, so to connect with what's happening in their own process, and then to use that as a springboard for discovery. And that happens through a particular inquiry process where participants are invited to speak about their experience, and then there's dialogue between the teachers and the participants, which enables that to emerge and become explicit and then get integrated into that person's understandings about themselves and how they relate to the world. So this participatory engagement is absolutely critical. And as you say, is certainly very different from how I experienced my early learnings about mindfulness practice in a Buddhist context. Where interestingly, actually, there was a certain encouragement not to talk about what one experienced during the practice. So it was quite novel for me when I encountered mindfulness-based programs as a form to actually discover this very explicit space where we really engage in this exploration. What happened? What did you notice? How are you understanding that? How did you relate to that experience in that moment? What's coming for you now as you speak about it? So just really inquiring in a very open, exploratory way about experience, and through that, coming to new understandings about ourselves.
And again, the ability to ensure the best possible opening and exploration for the participant is so keenly dependent on the embodiment of the teacher.
Hugely, yes. So the whole of that is conducted in a way that's very open-handed. So the teacher doesn't have an agenda about, what a person needs to discover in a particular moment. The basis of all of those conversations within the class is what people are actually noticing, and helping them to articulate that and make discoveries from that. That comes from this embodied process that the teacher is engaged in, of actually working in ways that are non-striving, non-fixing, trusting the emergence of experience as it happens moment by moment, allowing people's experience to be as it is.
Which can be very different than sitting on the mountain seat giving a talk.
Very different. Very, very different, yes.
So there's another part of the paper which I found fascinating, because this is something that I'm seeing more and more, is that there are adaptations of programs. And there's a section in here talking about integrating tailored elements into adapted programs. And you talk about 3 different kinds of adaptations. And I'm wondering if you might just chat about those for a few minutes and some considerations that implies.
Yes. This area is an example of a kind of creative tension in the field. So, of course, we need adaptations. So, as the mindfulness-based field is developing, novel kind of contexts and populations are emerging all the time who are interested in engaging with this work. And clearly, it wouldn't be appropriate to deliver exactly the same program to 5-year-old children as to 16-year-old children, or to ex-offenders as women who've survived domestic abuse. So all of these contexts, mindfulness is happening in huge diversity of different contexts. Business context is another huge area, and tailoring is completely appropriate. So there's this natural flowering which is to be celebrated, and there is a risk within that the tailoring, the adaptations happen without deep clarity of thought about the intentions of offering a mindfulness-based program in a particular context to a particular population. So it really needs somebody who's very embedded in the work of mindfulness-based program to understand the core intentions of the program before it was adapted, as it were. And then also to know the population and to know the context, to know really what are the experiences, the vulnerabilities, the themes, the life patterns that tend to be prevalent in that particular population or in that particular context, that the mindfulness-based program needs to link with, to map onto. And then how do we do that? So in the paper, we talk about 3 kinds of adaptations. Sometimes the adaptations emerge out of understanding about theoretical frameworks. And a very good example of that is the emergence of MBCT. So actually the development of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to prevent depression started out of a long theoretical and research journey, which actually wasn't involved in mindfulness. It was an exploration of the field of depression and what are the vulnerability factors that lead people towards repeated episodes of depression. And through that development process and through exploring how how one might skillfully enable people to work with those vulnerabilities. The 3 developers of MBCT linked with the work of John Kabat-Zinn and then created a mindfulness-based program, which became known as MBCT. So that was a kind of theoretical journey, which led to the emergence of MBCT. The second reason that we name for adapting a program is to make it more tailored towards a particular population. So the 2 examples we put in the paper are the program Mindfulness-Based Eating Awareness Training, which has emerged out of MBSR, but is very much tailored to people with challenges around eating and diet. And the practices within the sessions and the home practices are very much tailored towards the particular learnings around food and diet and eating that is intended to emerge out of that program. And mindful parenting, where there's an expectation that parents have less time to practice, but to do formal practice, but they've got infinite opportunities for informal practice of being with their children in a new sort of way. So the mindfulness-based programs that Susan Bogles has developed really integrates informal parenting practices into the whole shape of the program. And there's a lot of examples of those where there's been very careful thought put into how do we nuance this program to this particular context. And then the other sorts of adaptations are to do with particular context or setting. An example of that's got a lot of prominence, certainly here in the UK at the moment, is mindfulness teaching in school contexts, where clearly there's the way of teaching has to find its way into the overall curriculum of that school, and how that's going to happen is going to be shaped by the school environment and the needs of the teachers and the children in that setting. And so there's been a lot of thought. The program that is most common here in the UK is the DOT-B program, Pause and Breathe. That's given a lot of thought to both that context, but also to the population. The pedagogy within that program is a little bit different from how adult populations are taught. And mindfulness in business is another key example where it's very possible to do the work of bringing mindfulness into workplace contexts whilst really keeping the integrity of the underpinning intentionality of mindfulness-based programs. But adaptations are needed to work within the particular tensions that are going to be there in a workplace context. It's very often the inquiry process is very different when you're working with a group of people who know each other as colleagues, and there's hierarchies that exist in the space. And the teacher needs to be really sensitive to how they work with that. And different forms of interactional curriculum elements tend to get integrated into those programs to enable the particular learning themes that are prevalent in workplaces to emerge. So these sorts of adaptations are very, are really important to do, but they need thought and care and time and piloting and research, so that one knows that actually the adaptation is an improvement on the mindfulness-based programs that are already out there. It's really unfortunate when adaptations happen, and sometimes they're given the same name. So things are being adapted, but it's called MBSR or MBSR Light or MBSR sometimes it's still called MBSR, but it's taught only over 1 hour for 8 weeks. And clearly that can't be MBSR.
Right. It's interesting you brought up the business context, and that's one I'm very familiar with. We did, and you quoted you mentioned it as a source. Michael Chaskelson has been a guest on the podcast to speak about exactly that kind of setting.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if, as a final question, perhaps one of the, I think, most important ones to this discussion is, why is fidelity, integrity of mindfulness-based programming important? What does it matter?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. So it matters for a number of reasons. It matters because this is a very young and emergent field, and the research is promising, but it's just beginning. And in order for the next building blocks to develop in this field, the foundations need to be good. So from a research perspective, if you're researching MBSR, you really need to know that it's MBSR. Because otherwise you won't be able to compare your results to other MBSR studies. So that's really critical, that there can be comparability between all of the MBSR studies that are published in the field. And I feel very strongly that there's not enough reporting within research papers on mindfulness-based programs of how fidelity was attended to, what the training of the teacher was, which curriculum they were, referencing to the curriculum form that they were adhering to within the program, how the competence of the teacher was assessed during the trial. That's one area. The other area is that when mindfulness-based programs are being implemented in everyday settings and people are coming along to them in hospitals or general public contexts or schools, they need to know that what they're receiving is what the label is on the tin, as it were. So if they're attending a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, they need to trust that that's what it is. And this is, in a way, a basic sort of professional ethical piece that the field needs to attend to, is that there's clarity for the general public, that they can know that the teacher that they're being taught by has had the appropriate training to deliver that particular program. So clearly somebody who's been trained to teach mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to go out and label their class MBSR without actually also going and doing some MBSR teacher training to enable them to tailor what they already know from an MBCT context and build their MBSR skills. So each teacher is trained to teach a particular program, and they need to honour the training that they've got and be clear with their participants. So it's a matter of clarity to the general public. And again, it's a building block. It's about, the field is just beginning to emerge, and professional governance for the field is at a very germinal early stage. And it is just a very important piece, integrity piece, that there's integrity about how we label things, so that people can know what's what within the field.
I'm glad that you brought that up, and for those who are listening, in support of that importance of the fidelity and integrity, I am going to include 2 links on the episode page. One to the UK network for mindfulness-based teacher training organizations, and that is a listing of teachers, as well as the US version at UMass, the Center for Mindfulness Registry of Certified MBSR Teachers. So I'll be including those as well.
Yeah.
Rebecca, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
No, I think that we've covered the territory that I would have hoped to cover. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure to have conversation with you about these themes. They matter.
They do. Our guest today, Rebecca Crane. If you'd like to find out more about her work, I will be linking to her page. And thank you so much for joining us. Always good to speak with you.
A true pleasure. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.